And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are talking China, and specifically the relationship between China and the United States, as we enter into what appears to be a pitted, and from the United States view, existential race, competition, conflict between the U.S. and China. I'm specifically going to be referencing, this is just as a sort of point of reference. I'm not saying that this is, that this author of this article that I'm about to bring up, that they're representative of the U.S. intel community or anything like that. But I'm sure we're going to see a lot more articles like this. Title of the article, it's over in the Globe and Mail. Title of the article is "Regime Change in China is Not Only Possible, it is Imperative." Quote, end quote. Now, this is coming as a special piece, a sort of opinion piece from Roger Garside, who twice served in the British embassy in Beijing, coming, with his perspective from the other side of the Atlantic. But these are the kinds of words I'm sure we will hear at some point soon, and I'm sure are being said all over the place, have been said in back rooms of the National Security Council, of the CIA, of other authorities in the United States government, with the authority and the intent, I'm sure, to try to destabilize China at the highest level by overthrowing its leader. Now, whether this is necessary, whether this is good, what this would look like, I want to get into this conversation with our next guest, Caleb Maupin. He's a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. You can follow him, by the way, on Twitter at Caleb Maupin and read his articles at calebmaupin.com. Caleb, thank you for joining us this morning, and I want to hear your take. Should the United States or the Brits or the international community from this side of NATO, should we try to stage a coup in China? What's your take?
I think that would be very negative. I do not think that would be in our interest at all to try and destabilize China by toppling the Communist Party. And it's quite disturbing to see that put forward as a viewpoint. Could you imagine the reaction if there was a mainstream publication in China that was advocating that China maneuver to violently overthrow the U.S. government? Obviously there would be a lot of outcry, on our end. That article would be used endlessly to say that China was a threat to our national security. So the fact that this article was circulated in a British publication and so widely discussed, I think, is a sign that things are moving in not a good way. We're heading toward this new Cold War many people are talking about, and the potential dangers are very real, especially for Britain. To talk about that publication, let's not forget that the British waged 2 Opium Wars. The Opium Wars for the right to impose free trade on China, to flood the Chinese market with opium and basically beat down China's domestic industries and keep China a poor, impoverished country. That British domination was largely what Mao and the Chinese Communist Party were fighting against, the domination by British corporations that kept China impoverished. And it was, the Chinese Communist Party broke China out of that. It created one strong China, and in doing so, laid the economic basis for the eventual elimination of poverty in so many parts of life, the industrialization of the country. So I think that we need to look at it from that perspective.
Caleb, for the moment, I want you to put yourself in the headspace of somebody to even write an article like that. I mean, think about what we're saying for the moment. A country of what, 1.3 or 1.4 billion. And he feels perfectly justified, perfectly okay in commanding language to basically make an argument that we should basically destabilize the government of a country because we don't want to deal with the competition associated with that country, meaning the horses out the barn. We don't want to be able to deal with it. We don't know if we can deal with it. We don't know if we can compete in a way where we will win what is considered to be an existential struggle. And so his argument is overthrow the country. What is the headspace for an individual to have to even write that article? I mean, and maybe this is a difficult question to answer. I mean, but to stand there and that's not even whispered behind closed doors. The guy felt perfectly just and perfectly okay in saying this. He's not worried that the media would attack him for it. He's not worried that the political class would attack him for it. He feels perfectly justified in making this statement and enunciating it aloud to the world. Like that's astonishing. That's all.
Yeah, I think that the intent is probably not only for a Western audience to stir up the Western audience, to get a Western audience to think that the overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party is possible and something we should consider, but I think it was also probably intended to cause domestic problems within China, to create more of an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust among China's leadership. Because there are many people in China that do think that trading with the United States and Britain is something they ought to do, and there are different attitudes toward the Western countries, toward the Western system. We saw at one point in the 1990s the leader of the Chinese Communist Party saying that their goal was to eventually adopt a Western political model. Obviously, that's no longer the feeling. President Xi Jinping is arguing for, maintaining a lot of the unique traditions of the Chinese Communist Party, as well as Confucianism and such. But there is a very, very pro-British, pro-American axis within the Chinese government structure. And putting an article out there that talks about the merits of overthrowing the Chinese government is a way of creating a feeling of distrust within the country and raising the question of who is really loyal and who isn't, and creating an atmosphere where the Chinese Communist Party is internally, having people question each other and creating confusion. And, this was one of the weaknesses of the Soviet Union. At the time the Soviet Union fell, there were very different opinions within the Soviet Communist Party. There was one wing of the Soviet Communist Party that was very, very pro-American and basically didn't believe in communism anymore. And there was what you called the conservative opposition, which were folks that were, they were in the Communist Party, but they were arguing. They saw Stalin in a positive light, and a lot of them were even moving beyond Marxism and towards more traditionalist and Orthodox Christian Orthodox nationalist views. But yet, because of the Soviet system, they all just kind of mouthed the party line in public. You thought that the whole government in the Soviet Union all agreed and were all on the same page, but in reality, there were very, very different viewpoints beneath the surface. And China, because it maintains the one-party state, that political model, you don't have the open debate where you know exactly where everyone stands, and that is a weakness of the Cold War really existing socialism model. Now, China has moved toward a more market economy, but they still do maintain a system where you don't have open, straight-up debate between government officials. So, this introducing articles here's the way they introduce paranoia.
And it would. And up until a year ago, I would have reserved that type of criticism for China singularly among world governments, at least on the scale that they're operating on. As a superpower, I would have cast them singly as a kind of culturally and politically authoritarian country, the likes of which we're not familiar with in contemporary history on the world stage, except for the United States, except for the fact that here in the U.S., more than countries in Europe, it seems that out and open, sort of by a weird hidden sleight of hand, political debate, the Overton window is so tightly circumscribed along very specific lines of disagreement and lines of confrontation. Anything outside of it too far to the right is castigated as fascist or alt-right. Anything too far outside of it to the left, some stuff is accepted, but increasingly people are rejected simply as radicals. And certainly in terms of what's politically feasible, debates had in Congress, debates had in the mainstream media or the establishment media here in the United States, it seems like we have so leveled the possibility of a genuine edifice of conversation, the possibility of some ongoing, political, cultural, real dialogue with ourselves. Instead, where it's like we're struck with these culture wars that we've had a brief reprieve from under Biden, but that are still, they show all the signs of being as strong as ever if and when we come back to that level of civil conflict. And as we saw on January 6th, it seems like it can happen at any point, and it seems like we're forever an inch away from that kind of catastrophe, which again seems to me to be the result of exactly that circumscription, of exactly that setting of boundaries in terms of what people are allowed to express, what people are allowed to debate. In other words, the propaganda here in the West does the job of the one-party government as it operates in China. But the other irony, and this is where I want to go here, there's this other weird turn. It seems like as these sort of, as the paragon of capitalism and democracy, what we would thrive on is not only open debate, but also open competition. The whole foundation of capitalism is that you allow for competition, free competition, not mandated by any political authority, free competition between open parties. And yet we seem to turn against that at every turn when it comes to our relationship with China. I want to go briefly. You might have been listening to the last bit of our headlines, whether or not you were. We were talking about the space station and the idea that China is planning on creating their own space station. They just launched their first module within the past few days. They're planning on having that up and fully operational by late 2022. This comes as Russia is also planning on launching its own space station, getting its own version of this in order sometime a little bit later, call it 2025, 2026, when they're talking about doing this after their commitments to the ISS are over. Jamarla, and I'm just curious to hear your take on this. Jamarla and I were just getting into a debate, not even really a debate, but just kind of a short back and forth about whether or not that's good or justified, that kind of competition extending beyond the sphere that we live on into outer space. I believe you're somewhere on the left politically. Could you just, actually, Caleb, could you briefly identify yourself politically? And then how would your political beliefs weigh on that? I believe you're like a Marxist-Leninist or something like this. How does that affect how you view that competition? Caleb.
Sure. Well, I'm a socialist, an anti-imperialist. I come out of the Marxist-Leninist tradition. I consider myself to be a man of the left. And yeah, I think that it would be better if Russia and China and the United States were cooperating in space. If rather than having it be viewed as a space race or a competition, that the countries could work together to achieve their ends. Before John F. Kennedy was killed, he called for the moon mission to be joint, be a joint effort for the Soviet Union and the United States to work together to try and reach the moon. And I mean, imagine how different history could be, if the Soviet Union and the USA had been working together on that moon mission, like Kennedy had idealized in his speech at the UN. And I am all for the space program because, especially now, I think the space program is a matter of resources. We talk about the limited resources on the Earth and the use of different technology and the need to get beyond fossil fuels. And largely, what is driving the Chinese space program is their drive for fusion energy. I mean, they recently acquired helium-3 from the moon for the purpose of fusion energy research. And Russian President Vladimir Putin has called for an international joint effort around fusion energy. And I think that would be a great thing if the United States, Russia, China, India, and other countries were working together to get beyond fossil fuels to develop fusion energy. I think that would be a huge step forward because the fossil fuels are really just a trap for the human race at this point. We can't keep going the way we're going in terms of climate change. It's not going to work. In terms of the economy and the global economy and development, it's not going to work. We got to get off of fossil fuels. And I think the answer to getting off of fossil fuels is an answer that largely involves resources and the space program and scientific and technological development. So I'm very pro-space program. I just don't want to see it in a competitive way. I think it would be better if great powers were cooperating.
1,000% agree.
I can agree with that. Jamal, what's your take?
No, I just said 1,000%
disagree
agree
with that too. I think the competition. I think that the space race. I'll put it like this: it didn't seem to get deadly, but it did get men put on the moon, people get put on the moon within just a couple of years of it starting. And I don't know that there would have been that success if there hadn't been an element of rivalry and sort of productive competition in it. And what I'm worried about, of course, is that this is going to turn militaristic, that this is going to be used, that the different space stations are going to be used to, research advanced. This is just one possibility, but as an example, used to research advanced military technologies that we're going to try to use against other countries and that other countries are going to try to use against us. That seems like the kind of thing that we would do. At the same time, though, if we're sort of spurring each other on using the track and field race mentality that China's defense minister brought up a couple of days ago when he was talking about a competition between the United States and China, if we had that attitude, I could see it going well. We need to close this out. Jamarl's going to bring us back. We're joined by Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with Caleb on the other side of this short break.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So, our Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, basically gave his first big policy speech. And in the speech, he basically made the point that says, if we want peace, prepare for war. Let's play the clip.
But the way that we fight the next major war is going to look very different from the way that we fought the last ones. And we all need to drive toward a new vision of what it means to defend our nation. In this young century, we need to understand faster, decide faster, and act faster. Our new computing power isn't an academic exercise. This is about real-world, real-time advantages. It's about fully grasping a situation moving at the speed of war. Galloping advances in technology mean changes in the work that we do to keep the United States secure across all 5 domains of potential conflict. Not just air and land and sea, but also space and cyberspace.
Let's stop right there.
They mean
He doesn't necessarily announce an enemy, even though there's this clear specter of something there. And the speech, basically, I want to get into a conversation on whether or not he's right. Is it one of those things that in order to prepare for peace, you must also basically prepare for war? To have a conversation about this, we're joined with Caleb Maupin. He's a writer, speaker, journalist, political analyst, and author. His new book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts her rise to prominence in the context of changing political discourse and the geopolitical stage. Now, Caleb, I actually, believe it or not, think he's right. Now, I don't think he's right as an absolute. I think he's right in our current context of the world, because we have this kind of competitive, resource-based mindset where it's this kind of it's a competitive edge, meaning getting land, getting resources, getting your hand on materials, being able to control, being able to dominate. That's our mindset. We could function in a cooperative way, meaning it's nothing to stop humanity in the abstract from functioning in a cooperative way, but in the very specific context of the way we were raised and the way that we function, in the games that we play, in the movies that we watch, all of those things are oriented towards this issue of dominance. And that's basically what plays out on the geopolitical stage. So from the standpoint of peace and everything else, yeah, on some level in our world, peace is at the barrel of a gun with this ever tightrope of brinksmanship that continuously takes place, where at any horrible moment, something tragic could take place, but by the same token, the strategic balance is the thing that keeps these things in balance of sorts. What are your thoughts? Is that too cynical? Is that too dark of a point of view? But it does seem like to be the prevailing characterization of our world. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm forced to remember a very famous essay by the anarchist Emma Goldman. She wrote an essay called Preparedness, the Road to Universal Slaughter. And it was at a time where these similar arguments were being made in the lead up to World War I. Oh, the United States, we don't want a war, so we need to spend lots and lots of money on building up our military in order to have peace, in order to stay out of World War I. And Emma Goldman was correct in that the preparedness for World War I ultimately led to, the U.S. being involved. And one thing that it must be pointed out is in international rivalries, every move that you consider to be defensive, your opponent on the global stage is going to see as offensive. And every move that your opponent takes that you see as offensive, your opponent themselves sees it as defensive. And this is how international events tend to escalate.
That's
right?
true. Wait, Caleb, I agree with you. That's true on some level. But there is an objective point of view of this stuff. Meaning, if I make a move, I am making that move. This is not a situation where both of us are just balanced. There are times where one country does make a move where, yes, the country may call it defensive, but honest actor looks at that move and says, okay, clearly that country is doing, like, for example, freedom of navigation. Is that a defensive move or is that an offensive move? Objective person looking at that.
Well, in a way, I mean, from the perspective of the United States, and this is a lot of the interesting aspects of a lot of this rhetoric we hear around China and around global relations, there is this assumption on the part of our leaders that we dominate the world by default. And if anybody interferes with that, they are being offensive. And, for example, U.S. military presence in the South China Sea, right? They say, look, we're the United States, and by default, we can go everywhere we want. So, why shouldn't we have a huge military presence in the South China Sea? Well, no. China looks at that and they say, well, actually, no, we get a lot of our oil tankers, from the South China Sea. It's the South China Sea. And, our economy is zooming ahead, and we want to make sure the United States doesn't have the ability to cut off our oil supply at some point by blocking the South China Sea. So, they increase their military presence there. And the United States says, wow, look at them. They're being offensive, right? They're challenging our freedom of navigation. Well, it's just kind of assumed that the United States dominates the international maritime routes.
Exactly.
And so China... and that's how this game is played.
But that forces.
China was setting up a huge military presence in the Gulf of Mexico. I think we would hear loud objections to that. But it's just kind of assumed that the United States dominates the world. You'll notice if there's a U.S.-backed government around the world, they won't call it a pro-U.S. regime. They'll call it an open society.
Right.
That's the Open Society Institute of George Soros, right? It's open. But then if an anti-imperialist or a socialist government comes in, all of a sudden, the country is closed down, right? I mean, this is the way the rhetoric is framed.
Well, I know this rhetoric,
but I think generally people are tired of it. People are tired of the wars. With the war on terrorism, quote unquote, through 9/11, the argument was made, we were attacked on our soil. This is the kind of unprecedented event we hadn't seen since Pearl Harbor. Extremely deadly attack. So there's a justification for us to strike back. Now, whether that justification was actually justified, whether what we did in response to that isn't another matter. And I think a lot of people would think, no, it isn't. No, the wars in Iraq, specifically the war in Iraq, but a lot of people would include our extensive engagement in Afghanistan, which we're still in. Can't put too sharp a point on that. We're still technically in that war. That these things were not justified responses. But at least with that, there was an attack on U.S. soil. There was some sense that we needed to reciprocate and keep this kind of thing from happening again. I don't see anything like that with either China or Russia or Iran, which seem like the two, likeliest candidates for a war within the next decade or so. I don't see anything like that. And so I agree with you for the large part here, Caleb, not just on the sort of reciprocative escalation between different sides in an abstract sense, but also just if you build up a military and it costs you quite a bit of money, you're going to look for ways to use it. You're not going to just sit back, rest on your laurels, use it as a walking stick. You're going to use the cudgel as a cudgel. You're going to use the long arm that you've created to try to strike whatever you oppose on the international scene. And I think that the other side of this is folks are more tired of that in the United States than ever. If Biden were actually pushing for a war, if he and Lloyd Austin weren't just vaguely signaling that we're ready for conflict and that the situation with China has changed, but if they actually proposed a war with China, I don't see people going for that here in the States.
Well, when it comes to 9/11, I just have to say, that the situation is worse than you portrayed it, because after 9/11, China was fully supportive of the United States. Russia was fully supportive of the United States. Libya was fully supportive of the United States. The countries around the world that we view as anti-imperialist or countries that are geopolitical rivals were totally with the United States, because they've been fighting al-Qaeda type forces for decades, right? And the tragedy of the war on terror is that, all these countries that are our rivals would be happy to fight a real war on terror with us. But instead of fighting a war on terror, the USA maneuvered through, the so-called war on terror in the aftermath of 9/11, not to fight al-Qaeda, but to first overthrow the Ba'athist Arab socialism, government in Iraq, which is a secular government, and blow Iraq to bits. A country that was not a place where Al Qaeda had a safe-hold, but now you have all kinds of Wahhabi and ISIS terrorist groups. Libya was a big supporter of the war on terror, even tortured people as part of the rendition program, and was a huge supporter of the war on terror. But Libya has been blown to bits, and now you have Al Qaeda and ISIS types operating in Libya. And Syria, another secular anti-imperialist government, has been destabilized. Where instead of fighting the terrorists, instead of having a real war on terror, something that China and Russia, I think, would be fully on board, a real war on terror. Russia has dealt with the Chechen Wahhabi, separatists and such. Instead, we've been fighting a war against anti-imperialist states. And at the end of the day, where did these terrorists even come from? Where did Al-Qaeda come from? It was during the Cold War. You said, United States, backed them to fight the Soviet.
Yes, backing the Mujahideen, exactly. And you said China and Russia. You brought up in Chechnya. Of course, the whole deal with the Uyghurs, the issue in Xinjiang, is their terrorism. That, as far as I can tell, from the Chinese government's perspective, is the entire reason for what they're doing that the United States is calling a genocide. Which, by the way, of course, as we covered on the show before, the National Endowment for Democracy has backed the Uyghurs. Various Western intelligence agencies have backed them, supported the terrorism. It seems, and yet at this point, we're kind of willing to ignore that and only take up one side of the argument. But you brought up Russia with Chechnya. Literally, one of the main things that we're using to hit China right now is part of their pushback against domestic terror.
Yeah. Yes, and the scandal of the war on terror is that that we're not really fighting the terrorists, and that is ultimately the scandal there. And that that it seems like in this drive to dominate the world and beat back emerging anti-imperialist states, terrorism is just considered to be just a side effect we have to deal with. It seems like the Brzezinski strategy of utilizing proxies to attack governments you don't like, it has this blowback effect where you get, dangerous Al-Qaeda extremist kind of groups. And it seems like our leaders don't really seem to mind that. Their main goal is this new Cold War, is this drive to beat down their geopolitical rivals. And things like 9/11, they just see as just kind of, I guess that's a side effect we all have to deal with. And I don't think the American people see it that way. I think that they want to be safe from terrorism.
I don't think the American people even know that it's blowback. I mean, I don't even think the American people are aware of that. I mean, mainstream media, for the most part, keeps that stuff quiet. Also, this kind of makes my point. There's some perspectives of the world and some framings of the world based on, let's say, governments that put you at odds with other governments. Like, meaning it's not everybody taking a defensive position. There is an objective point of view in regards to the way people or countries behave. If I put a missile platform in space and your country, not wanting to be subjugated, has to do one of two options. It either is going to be very close friends with me, or it's going to put its own missile platform in space. It's not that it wanted to do it. It had to do it as a response to the other country. It's the same thing with, around the world. You have countries that it starts investing all of this money into missiles or weaponry and everything else, but it's doing so as a rebuff, as a balancing, not necessarily as an assertive actor. That's the point that I'm trying to make here. There's some perspectives of the world that force countries to take various positions in either defense or in repudiation just to maintain a certain strategic balance. Does that make sense? That's what I'm trying to get at here in regards to Austin's speech. It's not so much that I think this is absolute, like in regards to the framing of things. No, the world could take a different point of view that's cooperative. But that's not our point of view. The world is not that way. That's not the language, and that's not the way to which we operate. And because it's not the way to which we operate, one country trying to be a dove when the other countries are sharks, that thing's going to get eaten alive. Does it make sense, Caleb? I wanted to just to make sure that the point was made in regards to why I was taking the framing. I get that it's an escalation, but sometimes the escalation is impossible to avoid based upon whatever the primary mover is.
Indeed. Well, I think the road to peace is economic cooperation. When countries are trading with each other, they're unlikely to go to war with each other. And that the more that there can be material abundance and prosperity in the world and countries working together economically, the less we're going to see military rivalries divide the world and destroy things. And that's really my hope, is that, you know, what China's doing with the Belt and Road Initiative and kind of building up an alternative form of globalization where countries get stronger by trading with each other, that is really the way out of this. And that the road of destruction and the military-industrial complex, I don't think it's going to get us anywhere as a country.
No, I mean, I disagree. I mean, look, I agree with you that the economic thing is important, but that's assuming that the countries focus on the economic aspect of it. If the countries focus on this notion of dominance, then that's the game space. That's the game to which we're playing. You can't play an economic game when one of the countries is looking at geopolitics, and especially if the country doesn't believe it can win in regards to competing in that economic game of abundance. Doesn't make sense. I just want to be clear. It just seems like there are certain positions that countries take that force and compel other countries to take similar opposing strategic balance positions. And just going with the economics thing.
It sounded like Caleb was saying that we do have a choice, and that if we chose geoeconomics over geopolitics, if we chose mutually productive economic relations over mutually destructive military arrangements, that'd be better for us.
Yes. Okay,
right?
I can agree with that, but it depends on better.
Is that fair, Caleb?
Yeah, and that would be my viewpoint. Yes, and that. You know, I mean, and especially a lot of these issues that we deal with in terms of terrorism, in terms of narco gangs, they are rooted in economic problems. I mean, look at what's happening, you know, south of our border. I think that's an economic problem.
Agreed. I can agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can agree with that. It's just not everybody values that economics over the geopolitics. That's all. But no, I can agree with that. Right. I totally agree with that.
Yeah, we've been trained to view international relations like some kind of zero-sum game where there's winners and losers, and that's a very dangerous way of viewing things. And that, you know, I mean, you can talk about the history of geopolitics and a lot of the writing about Atlanticism and the British Empire and the way that they viewed the world through controlling the trade routes. And yeah, it's a very deadly worldview that's going to lead us toward big confrontations. And I would urge us to see things and frame things in a different way. Russia and China aren't going away. You know, we thought in the 1990s, oh, it's the new world order, you know, the Soviet Union, this is the past, the West is going to dominate. Well, it didn't take too long for that situation to be reversed. And Russia and China are going to exist. So I think we ought to figure out how to deal with a world that is multipolar rather than trying to fantasize that somehow unipolarity is going to return.
1,000% agree. The voice that you guys are listening to is Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. His new book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts her rise to prominence in the context of changing U.S. political discourse on the geopolitical stage. You can follow Caleb on Twitter at Caleb Maupin and read his articles at calebmaupin.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.